It should be no surprise to anybody, given the news streams and the constant amount of information that we get, that the human systems that we inhabit and humanity itself is in the middle of a major disruptive crisis. These challenges are coming at us from every direction. We could list pages of factors that are affecting how we live our lives in the 21st century, and the challenges and the threats and the promises that this situation offers to us. Institutions that were designed in the 20th century to deal with 20th century issues are struggling to fulfill their mission in the 21st century, which is characterized by complexity, by uncertainty, by unpredictability, competing narratives, competing points of view, overwhelming demands, and shrinking resources. They invest more and more on control of their systems. They use accountability metrics. They do predictive analytics, risk management, employee training. And yet, no matter how much they spend and how much effort they put into this, the outcomes are less and less successful. And the morale of the people who are working in these systems becomes more and more problematic. And the government isn't much help either, because even in governance systems, we now have such polarization, ideological polarization, that nothing much is getting done at all in that setting. And so people are losing faith. They're losing faith in their institutions, they're losing faith in their companies, in their businesses, and they're losing faith in their government. And nowhere is this more obvious than with young people. And my work looks at the relationship between the internal experience of people in specific cultures and the changes in the cultures at large. We know from psychological research now that there is that the external environment and the internal psychological structures differ from culture to culture. So I'm interested in what's happening as our culture moves from a modern culture, from a 20th century industrial culture, into a digital culture and a global culture. And my concern is that we are vastly underestimating the challenge of this cultural transition on the psychological capacities of people who are living in the 21st century. The effect of all this is creating emergencies on at least 3 levels. On the one level is the real level, the level of things not working, the level of breakdowns in systems that we used to be able to rely on, and political crises and economic crises, the financial meltdown. These are all examples of the concrete emergencies that are being generated by the cultural shifts underway as we move into the digital age in the 21st century. But there's also a conceptual emergency. And a conceptual emergency is defined in IFF terms, is when the conceptual frameworks with which we usually interpret reality, the logics, the epistemologies, the science, the facts, what we take as reality, no longer map on to the world that we have to deal with. And we try to use the frameworks that we all learned in school, the scientific methods and the conceptual strategies for dealing with information that were fine in the 20th century, but really are not adequate to the challenges of the 21st. And this sets up a gap between the demands of the world and our conceptual apparatus that we have for dealing with it. And in that gap, we have the psychological experience of being asked to make meaning and make sense out of very complex, very uncertain and indeterminate realities, multiply determined problems, wicked problems, as they say. We're having to make try to make sense of those using logics and using patterns of mind that no longer work. Now this causes the third emergency, which is the existential emergency, because when you're in this gap between what you have to deal with and your equipment for dealing with it, this generates a great deal of anxiety. And with the anxiety comes questions like, well, who am I? What am I good at? What am I competent at? How should I raise my kids? What kind of relationships work in this kind of world? What kind of aspirations make sense in a world where climate change is threatening and we really don't know what the future holds? And so the existential emergency then is what we live with every day, is our experience of living in this kind of world. And so we have the concrete reality emergency, we have the conceptual emergency, and we have the existential emergency that every single one of us is experiencing to some degree or another. So Western culture, for sure, and probably most cultures, are at an inflection point. We appear to be teetering on the edge of a potential catastrophe where the world as we know it is no longer sustainable into anything like the long-term future. And in this inflection point, we would identify 3 different possible scenarios that can stem from this. One scenario we would call the neurotic scenario, which is to pretend that nothing's happening, which is to deny the signs that are all over the place and say, no, this is no worse than it's ever been. And to increase levels of control, increase rigidity, try to simplify things by not allowing into our awareness the actual complexity that is our reality. And that situation may work briefly, we all use it sometimes, but over the long haul, investing in trying to hold things still when the river is moving turns out to be, from an evolutionary perspective and probably from a sociological perspective, a very expensive and usually inadequate proposition. Another possible scenario we would consider to be chaotic, and where things have become so unbalanced and so out of control that they're in catastrophic breakdown. And in that kind of a situation, there is no control, there is no predictability, there is no solidarity, and anxiety levels are extremely high, and behavior often results in really violent changes and violent attempts to hold on to things, usually without a great deal of success. And in the past, I would have said that our Western cultural option right now is the neurotic option. Increasingly, we're seeing real breakdowns in civic order, real breakdowns in how things used to work, that we seem to be flirting with chaos. But there is a third option, and anyone that's worked in systems change, has probably had experience of this option. And this would be, instead of trying to hold on and hold things from changing, or just throwing up your hands and letting the chips fall where they may, there's a possibility for a transformative movement out of this kind of high tension and high complexity. And as Jung once said, we don't solve our problems, we don't solve our existential problems, we grow beyond them. And the transformative response would be a response that would grow us beyond, in which we would essentially learn to play a bigger game. And learning to play a bigger game is really a matter of developing greater capacities as humans to live in the complexity of the times and to live in the new world that we've created. And this brings us to the core of the work that we're doing, which is to consider what kind of people, what kind of persons would we need to have to successfully make this transition to a transformative new world that can actually handle the capacity and the challenges of the 21st century? In 1969, the American psychologist Carl Rogers gave a graduation speech to the Sonoma State University in California, where he said that he saw around him a new kind of person emerging. He called these people persons of tomorrow. What he noticed was that they seemed somewhat different from their parents. They had a different kind of way of being in the world. They were process people. They were people who were very tolerant and actually embraced diversity. They were people who were more in touch with their emotions. They were people who had a better balance between mind and body. They were people who were curious about growth and about changing their consciousness. And they were people who seemed to be quite at home in rapid change and the turbulence of the 1960s. Another dimension that he noted was that although many of them were university educated, they had a good balance between their cognitive capacities and their emotional and intuitional capacities. They had a wider bandwidth in terms of how they dealt with the world. They were just as interested in the arts and mythology as they were in science and ecology. They're very much more interested in their contact with nature, for example. But they were interested in nature both from a scientific point of view and also from the point of view of aesthetics and the experience of actually being in nature. They were empathic, more empathic. They were self-reflective. They were concerned about the quality of their relationships. They were open to diversity. They were interested in gender balance. So there's a whole range of capacities and ways of being that they seem to demonstrate that, in Rogers' view, prepared them well for the complexity of the world that was emerging at that time. So what gives me hope, actually, is that it turns out that Rogers' persons of tomorrow, as he called them, they're everywhere. All over the planet, there are people who look a lot like Rogers' persons of tomorrow, who are engaged in transformative projects, whether it's small projects in villages in Africa or whether it's part of transforming the National Health Service in the UK. These people are taking the risk to step out on a limb to say, I'm not going to wait for somebody else to change things. I'm not going to wait for some other processes to be applied. I'm going to get involved and try to make a difference myself. And so my hope, my optimism, if you like, for the work that we're doing and that we're introducing here is that these people don't have to be created. They're already here. What we need to do is to increasingly find ways to support these people, to help them do the transformative work that they want to do, with the real expectation that if enough people do that, then we will have a transformative force in the culture that can take us into a livable and a sustainable 21st century.